What does Pan-Africanism mean to you? Either of you could start.
I'll start, and I'm glad you raised that because I wanted to raise it in that so many of these borders that exist in Africa, we had no part in putting up. And because of that, right, we believe that Pan-Africanism, whilst we respect each other's identities and regions and areas that we come from, if we remain connected via community, if we continue to support each other and build each other up from a community perspective, we can break down and we can lessen the impact of the institutionalized colonialism, apartheid, disenfranchisement from an economic perspective. We can collectively lessen that burden for everybody on this continent. And I think that for us is something that we believe in.
All right, you guys, let's get into first.
There is a movement promoting our stories, and many of us grew up with a strong craving for images we can relate to. Production teams, writers, creative heads have come together to tell stories, and this podcast is their voice. The themes covered are very relevant to the Black community, and anyone concerned by the social and racial injustices that are in place to stifle this voice. The Pan-African voice is not easily heard, and here we talk about our movies, that film or doc which you heard about but didn't get to see. What was the story? Where can I watch it? It now has a voice. Tune in. We walk you through these stories and interview the filmmakers. Welcome. Karibu sana. Karibu sana.
And starting right on the lens. Ready? And action.
PanAfricanFilm.com. PanAfricanFilm.com. Visit us on the site to learn more about the Pan-African Screenwriters Retreat this August 18th through 22nd on St. Helena Island. Submit your story and join us for a breather and dive into your script with 4 excellent mentors.
I'm so excited today. We were talking with Noel and Pragna from NEWF, which is NEWF. And you can find it at newf.co.za. And tell us a little bit about yourself. What is NEWF? How long have you been building it? Please just introduce yourself to, the podcast audience.
I'm Pragna, and I'm the co-founder and executive director of NEWF. And NEWF stands for Nature, Environment, and Wildlife Filmmakers.
And my name is Noel Kok, and I am also a co-founder of NEWF. My role is specifically programs and partnerships within the organization. And we were established back in 2017. We are based in Durban, South Africa. And back then, we had just completed producing our first nature, environment, and wildlife conservation TV series. We had produced it and broadcasted it in 2015, and it had completely bankrupted us. So I'll probably leave it there as a means of introduction. Yeah, mic drop. And then be like, and then?
Then.
Yeah.
The Nature, Environment, and Wildlife Forum was birthed around, you said 2017, really?
2017. It was because of those personal challenges, because we had already come from a background of film and television, primarily producing entertainment content. And then the first time we tried producing something in nature and wildlife, that's when it completely bankrupted us. And we thought if we were having challenges and we had contacts and we knew people, how would anybody coming out of film school or even think of wanting to go into the genre of nature and wildlife?
From our experience in producing that TV series, we came to realize that Black African nature and wildlife filmmakers were rarer than most of the species scientists and conservationists were trying to protect on this continent. And, we looked at Africa, we saw that it is booming from a film and television perspective, except in the genre. And so instead of walking away with our tails between our legs, we decided that we need to do something to fix this. And so we started NEWF and it's called Nature, Environment, and Wildlife Filmmakers back in 2017.
Right. And it kind of culminates with the new Fellow Summit in Congress, which happens annually in Durban. And then you annually also, around that big summit, host a series of capacity building workshops and labs throughout the year. And it's all about really breaking barriers to entry and reclaiming the storytelling on our own environment. And it's beautiful. You've chosen to do this through community building. And so in this episode, we're going to feature and talk about the wonderful stories that your fellows have produced through outreach and just like capacity building. You are changing the narrative and empowering these scientists, researchers who join your workshops and labs to produce these films. And so I think you kind of answered my first question already there, Noel, because I was going to ask you about why filmmaking, but it seems like that was already your career path. And it's more about why the environment, why nature preservation. And it's really just because nobody was telling our own stories. And to do so for a professional filmmaker, right? It was already like breaking the bank. Huge barriers to entry there, right?
Absolutely. The most unbelievable barriers to entry. And I know Pragna always says to me, the line that I always say is, how do you change the story? And I want to maybe start that, in this discussions to maybe pose that question in terms of how do you change the story? And then maybe later on we can answer that particular question, as we speak about some of the work that we do, etc.
Yeah, I mean, the first film was Beyond the Fence, that we wanted to talk about. And in that one, we wanted to see, why filmmaking, how empowering local youth who are, studying conservation and working in the field, how does filmmaking become an important part of that empowerment? And, I love that scene when, he says when I first picked up the camera, like everything kind of falls into place for them.
The film you speak about was the second year of our Congress. That's one of the filmmakers had pitched that concept, right? And we had funded the production of that film, number one. And then number two, we had brought in some industry mentors she was a young emerging filmmaker at that particular point. We're extremely proud of her and what she's gone on to do. She's now a National Geographic explorer. She's made a number of short films. She's worked on a number of productions in nature and wildlife.
Being the Black young female guide, it's really shocking to other people. It's something rare. When I go to the airport to pick up my guests, they'll ask me like, what do you do? I'm like, a field guide. They were like, are you sure this is what you want to do? I'm like, yeah. Aren't you scared of elephants? I'm like, not at all. I feel proud and happy that I'm actually going to inspire. It's going to make me cry. That I know I inspire a lot of people. My name is Queen, and to be honest, I really feel like I'm the queen when it comes to this career.
Yeah, so we firstly support the filmmakers through the funding that they receive, but it mimics a real world broadcast opportunity that you may get, where you're taken through a producer's lab. You first develop your story with mentors, with facilitators who help you craft that story. And then you also go through what are the cost reconciliations? What do those need to look like? How do you make sure you're not overspending? How do you do your pre-production properly? How do you report properly? And you get paid out in tranches, like you would if you were delivering to a channel, where you give them your pitch, they pay you a portion. You deliver a rough cut, they pay you another portion. Once you close off and you you submit all your documents, you paid out the final tranche. So that experience becomes something that is getting you ready for a real world acquisition or commission that you may get from a broadcaster or even an independent film. And you need to report, how you spent your funding.
And then I think to close this out, what we started looking at was when we started looking at the narrative around nature, environment, and wildlife filmmaking that was coming out of Africa. We as Africans, and particularly Black Africans, were always being portrayed as the poacher, the pirate, the ranger, the guide, or people who will sing for you when you jump off your safari vehicle. That's the stereotypical narrative that used to come out of all these nature and wildlife stories that were being produced about Africa. And so we were like, okay, we can't just, have this annual gathering. What do we do to change this? How can we influence the narrative? How can we change the way these stories of Africa are being told and show and highlight and celebrate? Because there was this perception that was out there that the conservation of nature and wildlife was not particularly high on the,
on our agenda. It just wasn't something we thought about. No, I get it. Yeah. In fact, the film we chose to feature because I felt it really portrays that importance of representation, with communities who don't have that exposure and just don't have the opportunity really to share the positive experiences they have with their environment and with nature. And that was like Rise from Cape Flats.
I really just wanted to give kids in my neighborhood a reason to be curious and to spark a little bit of hope that they could do it too. I started to search for peace everywhere. And I found it somewhere I'd never thought to look, in the calmness of the ocean. I put on a mask for the first time. I remember how scared I was. Terrified on the surface. Terrified. That creepy soundtrack of Jaws started playing in my mind. Once I saw nothing was out to get me, I started noticing the beauty our ocean had. I got very sad thinking, why hasn't anyone brought me to do this before? I live 40 minutes away from the ocean. Why has it taken me 33 years to finally experience this? The more I dived, the more in love I fell.
Yeah, that was a beautiful film that one of your fellows produced. Can you tell us a little more about, that importance of the representation, how that matters?
I think you just said those exact words, how that representation matters. When you see somebody that looks like you doing something that you never thought was possible, immediately it's more relatable and it seems more possible and achievable to go out and do that. I mean, the filmmaker who produced that film, it was a friend of him that introduced him to freediving, that said, come with me, let me show you. And that friend looked like him too. So, immediately he thought, okay, let me go and see what this is all about. And now he is also actually a Nat Geo explorer, and he holds snorkel days every couple of months where he invites people from his community to come in and experience the ocean and just go in and see what lies beneath the surface of the ocean, right?
Representation is absolutely important. The Cape Flats is listed or regarded as one of the most dangerous places.
It is known, right? Let's let the audience understand.
Yes.
It is widely known across the continent. I've never been to South Africa.
Yeah.
But I know.
Exactly, right?
Like everyone knows.
Exactly. And, in the film, he talks about he was searching for peace. He was looking for peace. He lived 20 odd minutes away from the ocean. Yet it took him 26 years to discover the magic that lies beneath the surface of the ocean.
And to experience it.
Yeah, and to experience it. And I think that is something that is shared amongst so many of us all across the continent of Africa.
I can imagine that first event. And I think that first forum, I'm just imagining it all. Thank you, Noel. It's like, I want to thank you so much, Pragna and Noel. You're so brave to take on, like you said, something that's been, I guess, institutionally like implanted in us for so long. The reason I'm so excited is because what Pragna and Noel, what you're doing is just, to me, sounding revolutionary, right? Having been raised in East Africa and just haven't had the privilege, it is for us a privilege to have had access to our wildlife in a way that mostly is reserved for people who are white and exploring the beauty of Africa, right? I do consider it a privilege. I think you are breaking down huge barriers in giving people access by building these communities. And I wanted to elaborate on that privilege element a little bit, just a little bit, because tourism, is a huge source of income for most African countries, who are really truly blessed with the beauty of this wildlife. But for Africans, like for the people who live there, whose land it actually is and belong to, like for years and years and their ancestors, those people. So like for them, not the tourists, how can that have become a double-edged sword, tourism? We've seen a couple of films that address that. I particularly like Whispers of the Delta and Invasion.
Wildlife brings both possibility and plight. Through tourism, it creates income but brings affliction. And nowhere is this truer than in the domain of elephants.
Can you talk a little bit about that and how those films address tourism? Like, how does tourism sit with wildlife and the work that you do in conservation?
Yeah, I mean, and I sigh whenever I have to answer this question because
it's like
because it is a double-edged sword, right? We do need economic development. We do need tourism because tourism is a massive part of what drives Africa's economies. But yes, it is a double-edged sword because, for example, when we spoke about earlier about that TV series bankrupting us, right? One of our biggest challenges was access to wildlife, access to the stories, access to the game reserves. And why? Because of price, because of cost, all right? So many of everything to do with nature, environment, and wildlife in Africa is geared towards an international tourist, okay? So many scientists believe that they came to Africa to study and contribute to the protection of these species, etc. Yet, sadly, all they were doing was keeping African scientists out of their parks.
Exactly.
Why would they allow an African scientist to come into their park to study for free when an international scientist can come and pay you to study a particular species? Because guess what? It's because they don't have those species in their countries anymore. We are the only continent left with our megafauna. All the other continents probably ate most of it or hunted it all out. Okay.
Nairobi National Park in any other protected area is priceless. You cannot quantify the value of an open space, especially in a city such as Nairobi. In a weekday in Nairobi National Park or any other park, that silence, that ambience and tranquility. That's what I really strive to keep and to leave for my future children, because I want them to grow up falling in love with nature. Renard Bon Kenyandire, being on the forefront fighting for safeguarding Nairobi National Park for posterity. This is one of the major impacts of especially the SGR and other development inside the park. So it was introduced here by the Southern Bypass, then came the SGR, then the oil pipeline, and last year it was a very bad situation in the park. But due to a lot of mobilization, different groups coming in, but a lot of people pulling it out.
We need to see that wildlife tourism is supporting our communities, is creating access for those communities, it's not just about jobs, all right, but it's creating equity, and unfortunately, tourism doesn't create that equity. It only creates jobs. I grew up all my life believing that animals were more important than me, because they would declare remember, I grew up during apartheid. And so they would declare an area a protected area. Protected from who? Protected from what? We as Africans have always lived in harmony with wildlife and with nature. And so they would declare that a protected area and keep us out. And then as little kids, all we saw were white privileged people driving into those parks. Now, for 1 minute, we're not saying we don't value some of the investment that some of that brings, right? We do, but there has to be a balance. There has to be a situation where it can't be at the expense of Africans. It can't be at the expense of destroying this relationship that we had with nature.
Can we hear your perspective on community engagement and inclusivity when it comes to the conservation aspects and making those decisions that affect and impact the community so much? Why do you think that local people, the owners of these spaces, have been excluded from these conversations?
If you look at the film Hlulega, they speak about the fact that when they declared marine protected areas, the main scientist involved in helping government declare these marine protected areas did concede that in their consultation period, that process, that they maybe did not include or take into account communities' perspectives enough. In the beginning, I asked, how do you change the story, right? And the answer to that for us is you change the storytelling.
Conserving through protected areas is common in South Africa, but history records the exclusion of local people in developing them. It becomes important to include local communities in managing protected areas. Follow me on a journey as I find out how the youth adjacent to protected areas relate and view them.
If you have different people telling the story will change. You will get a different perspective.
My elders once told me that our happiness comes from the respect we pay to the land we walk on, the animals we coexist with, and the God we owe it all to. My name is Jamila Jannah, and I was born in the Eastern Cape.
I think you have a quote. Who's it by?
Yeah, that quote is a quote by Chinua Achebe that says, "Until the lion
learns to speak,
tell his own story, the tale will always be told by the perspective of the hunter."
It's funny, I'm reading things fall apart at the moment, and they just fall apart so quickly, right? It's that domino effect of what happened across the continent. It was just like, doo, 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 and everything fell apart. And I do think it's important to hone in on community, because it was our sense of community which allowed these as she said, invasion to happen and penetrate so quickly. I think the same thing happened here, to be honest, with the, as they call them, natives. I really don't have a good term for the original owners of the land here in America. But, like it was literally like disease and infestation, and just people allowing them so welcoming into their community. And we're so easy. And so like actually to capitalize on that is just super genius, because that empowers us in itself. And I really want to focus on the fact that you've really tackled the bull by its horns. You've gone into the deep end, so to speak, Noel and Pragna, and just said, conservation is what's bankrupting us. Okay, let's become the conservationists across the continent and bring everyone together, right? So tell us more about your, 2020 cohort, which you funded to tell the story of a fellow who, a marine scientist. Sorry, I keep calling them fellows, and it's almost like belittling, because these are, like you said, professional scientists. And in this case, and please tell me how to pronounce it. Is it Pefumla?
Pefumla.
Pefum. Yes, there you go.
Pefumla,
Yep.
which means
breathe.
So beautiful. Pefumla. And this marine scientist in Pefumla, which is, it just basically narrates this lab which you dedicated totally to marine filmmaking, and followed the scientists who could barely swim, right? Because this type of filmmaking has even more weighted challenges. Tell us, what challenges did the lab itself face, and what was like the most rewarding part of this initiative?
It's called Pefumla, which means breathe. And I always say, during we produced this film, or let's say that lab happened literally 1 month before the world shut down with COVID. And so when the world was being afflicted by a disease that would stop you from breathing, we produced the film called Breathe. And then a couple of months later, when most of the USA and the world was rallying around a call to justice of I Can't Breathe, we released the film Pefumla. And for us, it was such an important time, because 70% of the air that we breathe comes from the ocean. And, it was important that we encouraged Africans at that point to understand that the air that we breathe comes from the ocean, and that we have been removed from the ocean, and that our ancestors are calling us to come back, and that we need to start getting involved in protecting the ocean. And so, this was our second dive lab that we had done. And I think you can carry on in terms of, because you specifically were designed it in terms of what you wanted out of it.
So this lab we put together a cohort, sent out a call out, and put together a cohort of 2 cinematographers, a marine scientist, an editor, a producer, and a director. And they came and they participated in this dive lab, where they underwent all the official dive training and received the certifications. But during this time, they were also tasked to come up with a concept for a short film and produce it and edit it and get it ready to be put out in the world. And this story of Pefumla and this story of Loiso and him being the main character was a decision made by the cohort themselves. It's a story that they chose to tell, which also talks to the importance of stories like this not being told, and why they need to be told, and why they chose to tell the story. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I think the reward from this, right, was a kid from, and I mean, I call him a kid, but he's not a kid, right? But from a township, right? This is a young man from a township who is taken on the role of protecting the ocean. Where his mother's saying, hey, What do you mean you're going to the ocean? I sent you to go and study so that you can pay for all these others that also need to come and study.
And sorry to interrupt there, no, but just for the audience who might not know from other areas, what is a township? Like I understand what that means in South Africa.
Yes.
Can you just explain a little bit about the context of where the protagonist was coming from?
I mean,
explain how phenomenal the whole placing.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that I could compare it to. Is like, let's say maybe the projects in the USA and informal housing. In some cases, it's informal housing, but the townships is where during apartheid, Black South Africans were put into areas to live so that they did not, because we weren't allowed to live, wherever we pleased, right? And it was the apartheid spatial planning and growing up in a township, you lived with all the sort of social ills, unfortunately, of overcrowding, of underdevelopment, of poverty, of alcohol abuse, etc. It was also one of the most beautiful, vibrant places in the world, and where community, in order to overcome those challenges, where the most unbelievable sense of community and Ubuntu also existed, but very often that's not where you would associate scientists coming out of, or children from the township being able to swim.
Marine biologists going for a diving class.
Yes,
I wanted to explain that a little better because it's a beautiful film. So I do encourage everyone to see it. And I'm going to just ask about, your organization more specifically. There are a couple of films. One is called Reformed and the other one, Hurt by Science, which your fellows produced and were particularly impactful in exposing the damages that African wildlife and also our, fellow communities in Africa have had to endure due to this loss of power to foreigners kind of controlling and our conservation decisions. How does NEWF really want to expose that, but also tackle it?
Our most important program, and I alluded to it earlier, right, at the moment is called Africa Refocused. That program is a collaboration between NEWF and National Geographic Society. And our main objective is refocusing the narrative so that the stories of Africa are increasingly told by and from the perspectives of African people. So I'll go to Reform, for example, and show you how by refocusing the narrative, we are able to change that.
The poaching problem in Kapanda's area is because of poverty. A lot of tourism was done in this side of the park, the four side of the park, but on the Mchinga escarpment, the people from there don't benefit. They don't see any goodness of keeping wildlife. There's a lot of poverty there, and that's what made people like Kapanda to join poaching business.
One of the biggest challenges facing conservation in Africa is poaching, 100%, all right? But we can't only demonize poachers because then we are never going to get them to change. And if you look at Reformed, if you look at the way the story of Reformed is told, he humanizes the poacher instead of demonizing him. People can relate to him. They can relate as to why he took up poaching in the first place. But then in the arc of the story, you see that he had, it shows that he had no choice in the beginning. And then it became something that he thought, wow, this is great. I can just make money out of, etc. And then life had to deal him a really serious blow for him to stop, pause, correct himself, and say, hold on, I can change. I need to do it differently. And I can make a contribution towards conservation. And I can go from killing animals to protecting animals. Okay? What usually happens when we were not telling the story is it's only doom and gloom. The conservation stories were always doom and gloom.
One-sided.
Showing a poacher in, handcuffed in shackles, and that image is celebrated because the poacher was caught.
Yeah.
Right.
Never mind that he has a family and that he has children and that he's still a human being, you know, and for us as Africans, the way we tell that story is important because we've got to go back to communities and say, guys, we must be the last line of defense. And so by telling the story in this way, we are able to encourage more people from the community to say, yes, this is ours. This used to be ours. We're reminding everybody that this was a part of who we were and what we used to do. You know, the one thing I want to also point out with Reformed is listen to the music, because in there, one of our labs or capacity building labs is called Compose Yourself, right? And it's focused on getting Africans to compose music for nature and wildlife films, because we cannot complete a story in Africa unless you include the rhythms and the beats and the sounds of Africa in those stories.
Oh, the
Otherwise,
music is integral to our existence. So I totally get that. And there is music out there. It's so easy, like anything happens, people start singing. So why not? You're absolutely right. It's a huge part of any African story. I'm so happy that you're emphasizing these things. And there's something you said I want to just highlight to the audience, because it's actually a perspective that's new to me. I never thought about it. And it's the fact that as if we identify and we live in these spaces as our community members, if we're producing these stories and telling them, we have to go back and live there. So you have to face these people and be like, I told this story about you this way, and I stand by it. So thank you so much for telling us about NEWF, all the filmmakers out there who are telling their own stories about conservation in Africa, the environment and our nature and our oceans. You know, let's not forget about that part. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your new projects that you've got going on? You mentioned briefly Ikaya and some other fun activities that your partnerships have allowed you to start. And also, I just want to hear for the audience what you expect NEWF to look like, you know, in kind of the next 3 years.
Yeah, so Ikaya is our storytelling, research, and dive center that is based in Sodwana Bay in KwaZulu-Natal. And I think the need for that came about because we kept going to Sodwana Bay because it's a top 10 dive site in the world to conduct our dive labs. And the cost to be there for such a long period of time, and the cost of accommodation and the cost of, you know, catering and all sorts and being there, we realized that there was a need to create a space to accommodate the growing numbers of fellows that were coming into this community that we were building. And so Ikaya is, I think, more than just an accommodation facility that we have, but it's a home, and Ikaya means home for the fellows to come and to explore their ideas. It's where we host all our labs now, the producers labs, the story labs, the dive labs, and fellows are constantly in and out the doors working on various projects. I think you asked us a question earlier about where do we see NEWF in the next, right? So obviously, you know, more films, more fellows from across the continent, representation in all the regions, in all the countries.
Including the diaspora.
Right? And I think we always go back to what our vision is, right? And that vision is that the stories of Africa that celebrate and advocate for the protection of her natural history are told by a connected network of visual storytellers, organically led by Indigenous African voices. And that's our constant reminder. That's what we want to see grow and become the reality.
Yeah. And then I have one final question. It's a pop-up. But if you'd heard other episodes, you should have known it was coming. What does Pan-Africanism mean to you? Either of you could start.
I'll start, and I'm glad you raised that because I wanted to raise it in that so many of these borders that exist in Africa, we had no part in putting up. And because of that, right, we believe that Pan-Africanism, whilst we respect each other's identities and regions and areas that we come from, if we remain connected via community, if we continue to support each other and build each other up from a community perspective, we can break down and we can lessen the impact of the institutionalized colonialism, apartheid, disenfranchisement from an economic perspective. We can collectively lessen that burden for everybody on this continent. And I think that for us is something that we believe in.
He said it all.
He said it all, Pragna.
He said it all.
I must say you're like one of the most, I guess, synergetic couple I've interviewed. I do interview a lot of partner filmmakers, but with you, I can see how it works right away.
Well, we have a saying. We have a saying. I'm the dreamer, and she's the dream maker. Okay.
Yeah, some of your points were very practical, Pragna. So thank you for sharing the insights and the background to how your story came about. You know, it's very important to understand the opposition you faced, the challenges you faced, and that they're real and they're out there. So yeah, congratulations for finding that formula.
Just to add in terms of websites and stuff, it's obviously our website is www.newf.co.za. Very often people ask, how do they become a fellow? If you follow that website, there is an open call, usually at all times, for producer labs, for whatever labs are available during that year. There tends to be an open call from about March until July, August, and then we select and then we bring in those new fellows into the different cohorts, into additional labs that we already are running for the existing fellows within the organization. So if you keep checking the website, as well as I have no clue about
social media. Social media, Instagram and Facebook is at NEWF Community. LinkedIn is Nature, Environment and Wildlife Filmmakers, and Twitter is NEWF Africa.
Yeah. And then there's also Africa Refocus.
And directly from the NEWF website, you can link to the Africa Refocus website, which is housed within National Geographic Society.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Follow us at 360africa.news on Instagram and Spotify for all the podcast episodes, Pan-African Film Podcast, and don't forget to visit PanAfricanFilm.com. That is PanAfricanFilm.com for the latest on the Pan-African Screenwriters Retreat in South Carolina, August 18th.